Chapter 9 of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ben Wilford. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 9. The Life of Benito de Soto, the Pirate of the Morning Star. The following narrative of the career of a desperate pirate who was executed in Gibraltar in the month of January, 1830, is one of two letters from the pen of the author of the Military Sketch Book. The writer says Benito de Soto had been a prisoner in the garrison for 19 months, during which time the British government spared neither the pains nor expense to establish a full train of evidence against him. The affair had caused the greatest excitement here, as well as at Cadiz, owing to the development of the atrocities which marked the character of this man, and the diabolical gang of which he was the leader. Nothing else is talked of, and 1,000 horrors are added to his guilt, which, although he was guilty enough, he has no right to bear. The following is all the authentic information I could collect concerning him. I have drawn it from his trial, from the confession of his accomplices, from the keeper of his prison, and not a little from his own lips. It will be found more interesting than all the tales and sketches furnished in the annuals, magazines, and other vehicles of invention, from the simple fact that it is true and not fiction. Benito de Soto was a native of a small village near Corna. He was bred a mariner, and was in the guiltless exercise of this calling at Buenos Aires in the year 1827. A vessel was there being fitted out for a voyage to the coast of Africa for the smuggling of slaves, and as she required a strong crew, a great number of sailors were engaged, amongst whom was Soto. The Portuguese of South America have yet a privilege of dealing in slaves on a certain part of the African coast, but it was the intention of the captain of this vessel to exceed the limits of his trade, and to run further down, so as to take his cargo of human beings from a part of the country which was proscribed, in the certainty of being there enabled to purchase slaves at a much lower rate than he could in the regular way, or, perhaps, to take away by force as many as he could stow away into his ship. He therefore required a considerable number of hands for the enterprise, and in such traffic it may be easily conceived that the morals of the crew could not be a subject of much consideration with the employer. French, Spanish, Portuguese, and others were entered on board, most of them renegados, and they set sail on their evil voyage with every hope of infamous success. Those who deal in evil carry along with them the springs of their own destruction upon which they will tread, in spite of every caution, and their imagined security is but the brink of the pit into which they are to fall. It was so with the captain of this slave ship. He arrived in Africa, took in a considerable number of slaves, and in order to complete his cargo, went on shore, leaving his mate in charge of the vessel. This mate was a bold, wicked, reckless, and ungovernable spirit, and perceiving in Benito de Soto a mind congenial with his own, he fixed on him as a fit person to join in a design he had conceived, of running away with the vessel, and becoming a pirate. Accordingly, the mate proposed his plan to Soto, who not only agreed to join in it, but declared that he himself had been contemplating a similar enterprise during the voyage. They both were at once of a mind, and they lost no time in maturing their plot. Their first step was to break the matter to the other members of the crew. In this they proceeded cautiously, and succeeded so far as to gain over 22 of the whole, leaving 18 who remained faithful to their trust. Every means was used to corrupt the well-disposed. Both persuasion and threats were resorted to, but without effect, and the leader of the conspiracy, the mate, began to despair of attaining the desired object. Soto, however, was not so easily depressed. He at once decided on seizing the ship upon the strength of his party, and without consulting the mate, he collected all the arms of the vessel, called the conspirators together, put into each of their possession a cutlass and a brace of pistols, and arming himself in like manner, advanced at the head of the gang, drew his sword, and declared the mate to be the commander of the ship, and the men who joined him part owners. Still, those who had rejected the evil offer remained unmoved, on which Soto ordered out the boats, and pointing to the land, cried out, "There is the African coast. This is our ship. One or the other must be chosen by every man on board within 5 minutes." This declaration, although it had the effect of preventing any resistance that might have been offered by the well disposed to the taking of the vessel, did not change them from their purpose. They still refused to join in the robbery, and entered one by one into the boat, at the orders of Soto, and with but one pair of oars, all that was allowed to them, put off for the shore, from which they were then 10 miles distant. Had the weather continued calm, as it was when the boat left the ship, she would have made the shore by dusk; but unhappily a strong gale of wind set in shortly after her departure, and she was seen by Soto and his gang struggling with the billows and approaching night, at such a distance from the land, as she could not possibly accomplish while the gale lasted. All on board the ship agreed in opinion that the boat could not live, as they flew away from her at the rate of 10 knots an hour, under close reefed topsails, leaving their unhappy messmates to their inevitable fate. Those of the pirates who were lately executed at Cadiz declared that every soul in the boat perished. The drunken uproar which that night reigned in the pirate ship was in horrid unison with the raging elements around her. Contention and quarreling followed the brutal inebriety of the pirates. Each evil spirit sought the mastery of the others, and Soto, which was the fiend of all, began to grasp and grapple for his proper place, the head of such a diabolical community. The mate, now the chief, at once gave the reins to his ruffian tyranny, and the keen eye of Soto saw that he who had fawned with him the day before would next day rule him with an iron rod. Prompt in his actions as he was penetrating in his judgment, he had no sooner conceived a jealousy of the leader than he determined to put him aside, and as his rival lay in his drunken sleep, Soto put a pistol to his head and deliberately shot him. For this act he excused himself to the crew, by stating to them that it was in their protection he did the act, that their interest was the other's death, and concluded by declaring himself their leader, and promising a golden harvest to their future labors, provided they obeyed him. Soto succeeded to the height of his wishes, and was unanimously hailed by the crew as their captain. On board the vessel, as I before stated, were a number of slaves, and these the pirates had well secured under hatches. They now turned their attention to those half-starved, half-suffocated creatures. Some were for throwing them overboard, while others, not less cruel, but more desirous of gain, proposed to take them to some port in one of those countries that deal in human beings, and there sell them. The latter recommendation was adopted, and Soto steered for the West Indies, where he received a good price for his slaves. One of those wretched creatures, a boy, he reserved as a servant for himself, and this boy was destined by Providence to be the witness of the punishment of those white men who tore away from their homes himself and his brethren. He alone will carry back to his country the truth of heaven's retribution, and heal the wounded feelings of broken kindred with the recital of it. The pirates now entered freely into the villainous pursuit, and plundered many vessels. Among others was an American brig, the treatment of which forms the chef d'oeuvre of their atrocity. Having taken out of this brig all the valuables they could find, they hatched down all hands to the hold, except a black man, who was allowed to remain on deck for the special purpose of affording in his torture an amusing exhibition to Soto and his gang. They set fire to the brig, then lay to observe the progress of the flames, and as the miserable African bounded from rope to rope, now climbing to the masthead, now clinging to the shrouds, now leaping to one part of the vessel, and now to another, their enjoyment seemed raised to its highest pitch. At length the hatches opened to the devouring element, the tortured victim of their fiendish cruelty fell exhausted into the flames, and the horrid and revolting scene closed amidst the shouts of the miscreants who had caused it. Of their other exploits, that which ranks next to turpitude, and which led to their overthrow, was the piracy of the Morning Star. They fell in with that vessel near the island Ascension in the year 1828, as she was on her voyage from Ceylon to England. This vessel, besides a valuable cargo, had on board several passengers, consisting of a major and his wife, an assistant surgeon, two civilians, about 25 invalid soldiers, and 3 or 4 of their wives. As soon as Benito de Soto perceived the ship, which was at daylight on the 21st of February, he called up all hands, and prepared for attacking her. He was at the time steering on an opposite course to that of the Morning Star. On reconnoitring her, he at first supposed she was a French vessel, but Barbazan, one of his crew, who was himself a Frenchman, assured him the ship was British. "So much the better," exclaimed Soto, in English, for he could speak that language. "We shall find the more booty." He then ordered the sails to be squared, and ran before the wind in chase of his plunder, from which he was about 2 leagues distant. The Defensor de Pedro, the name of the pirate ship, was a fast sailer, but owing to the press of canvas which the Morning Star hoisted soon after the pirate had commenced the chase, he did not come up with her so quickly as he had expected. The delay caused great uneasiness to Soto, which he manifested by muttering curses and restlessness of manner. Sounds of savage satisfaction were to be heard from every mouth but his at the prospect. He alone expressed his anticipated pleasure by oaths, menaces, and mental inquietude. While Barbazan was employed in superintending the clearing of the decks, the arming and breakfasting of the men, he walked rapidly up and down, revolving in his mind the plan of the approaching attack, and when interrupted by any of the crew, he would run into a volley of imprecations. In one instance, he struck his black boy a violent blow with a telescope, because he had asked him if he would like his morning coffee of chocolate. As soon, however, as he set his studding sails, and perceived that he was gaining on the Morning Star, he became somewhat tranquil, began to eat heartily of cold beef, drank his chocolate at a draught, and coolly sat down on the deck to smoke a cigar. In less than a quarter of an hour, the pirate had gained considerable on the other vessel. Soto now, without raising from where he sat, ordered a gun, with blank cartridge, to be fired, and the British colors to be hoisted; but finding this measure had not the effect of bringing the Morning Star to, he cried out, "Shot the long gun and give it her point blank." The order was obeyed, but the shot fell short of the intention, on which he jumped up and cursed the fellows for bunglers who had fired the gun. He then ordered them to load the canister shot, and took the match in his own hand. He did not, however, fire immediately, but waited until he was nearly abreast of his victim, then directing the aim himself, and ordering a man to stand by the flag to haul it down. Fired with an air that showed he was sure of his mark, he then ran to haul up the Colombian colors, and having done so, cried out through the speaking trumpet, "Lower your boat down this moment, and let your captain come on board with his papers." During this fearful chase, the people on board the Morning Star were in the greatest alarm; but however their apprehensions might have been excited, that courage, which is so characteristic of a British sailor, never for a moment forsook the captain. He boldly carried on sail, and although one of the men fell from a wound, and the ravages of the shot were everywhere around him, he determined not to strike. But unhappily he had not a single gun on board, and no small arms that could render his courage availing. The tears of the women, and the prudent advice of the passengers overcoming his resolution, he permitted himself to be guided by the general opinion. One of the passengers volunteered himself to go on board the pirate, and a boat was lowered for the purpose. Both vessels now lay to within 50 yards of each other, and a strong hope arose in those on board the Morning Star that the gentleman who had volunteered to go to the pirate might, through his exertions, avert at least the worst of the dreaded calamity. Some people here, in their quiet security, had made no scruple of declaring that the commanding officer of the soldiers on board should not have so tamely yielded to the pirate, particularly as he had his wife along with him, and consequently a misfortune to dread, that might be though even worse than death. But all who knew the true state of the circumstances, and reflect upon it, will allow that he adopted the only chance of escaping that which was to be most feared by a husband. The long gun, which was on a pivot in the center of the pirate ship, could in a few shots sink the Morning Star, and even had resistance been made to the pirates as they boarded her, had they been killed or made prisoners, the result would not be much better. It was evident that the Defensor de Pedro was the best sailor; consequently the Morning Star could not hope to escape. In fact, submission or total destruction was the only choice. The commanding officer, therefore, acted for the best when he recommended the former. There was some slight hope of escaping with life, and without personal abuse, by surrendering, but to contend must be inevitable death. The gentleman who had gone in a boat to the pirate returned in a short time, exhibiting every proof of the ill treatment he had received from Soto and his crew. It appears that when the villains learned that he was not the captain, they fell upon and beat him, as well as the sailors along with him, in a most brutal manner, and with the most horrid imprecations told him, that if the captain did not instantly come, on his return to the vessel they would blow the ship out of the water. This report at once decided the captain in the way he was to act. Without hesitation he stepped into the boat, taking with him his second mate, 3 soldiers and a sailor boy, and proceeded to the pirate. On going on board that vessel, along with the mate, Soto, who stood near the mainmast, with his drawn cutlass in his hand, desired him to approach, while the mate was ordered by Barbazan to go to the forecastle. Both these unfortunate individuals obeyed, and were instantly slaughtered. Soto now ordered 6 picked men to descend into the boat, amongst whom was Barbazan. To him the leader addressed his orders, the last of which was, to take care to put all in the prize to death, and then sink her. The 6 pirates, who proceeded to execute his savage demand, were all armed alike. They each carried a brace of pistols, a cutlass, and a long knife. Their dress was composed of a sort of coarse cotton checkered jacket and trousers, shirts that were open at the collar, red woolen caps, and broad canvas waist belts, into which were the pistols and the knives. They were all athletic men, and seemed such as might well be trusted with the sanguinary errand on which they were dispatched. While the boat was conveying them, Soto held in his hand a cutlass, reddened with the blood of the murdered captain, and stood scowling on them with silence, while another ruffian, with a lighted match, stood by the long gun, ready to support the boarding, if necessary, with a shot that would sweep the deck. As the boarders approached the Morning Star, the terror of the females became excessive. They clung to their husbands in despair, who endeavored to allay their fears by their own vain hopes, assuring them that a quiet submission nothing more than the plunder of the vessel was to be apprehended. But a few minutes miserably undeceived them. The pirates rapidly mounted the side, and as they jumped on deck, commenced to cut right and left at all within their reach, uttering at the same time the most dreadful oaths. The females, screaming, hurried to hide themselves below as well as they were able, and the men fell or fled before the pirates, leaving them entire masters of the decks. When the pirates had succeeded in effectively prostrating all the people on the deck, they drove most of them below, and reserved the remainder to assist in their operations. Unless the circumstances be closely examined, it may be wondered how 6 men could have so easily overcome a crew of English seamen supported by about 20 soldiers with a major at their head. But it will not appear so surprising when it is considered that the sailors were altogether unarmed, the soldiers were worn out invalids, and more particularly that the pirate carried a heavy long gun, ready to sink her victim at a shot. Major Logie was fully impressed with the folly of opposing so powerful and desperate an enemy, and therefore advised submission as the only course for the safety of those under his charge, presuming no doubt that something like humanity might be found in the breast even of the worst of men. But alas! he was woefully deceived in his estimate of the villain's nature, and felt, when too late, that even death would have been preferable to the barbarous treatment he was forced to endure. Beaten, bleeding, terrified, the men lay huddled together in the hold, while the pirates proceeded in their work of pillage and brutality. Every trunk was hauled forth, every portable article of value heaped for the plunder, money, plate, charts, nautical instruments, and 7 parcels of valuable jewels, which formed part of the cargo. These were carried from below on the backs of those men whom the pirates selected to assist them, and for 2 hours they were thus employed, during which time Soto stood upon his own deck, directing their operations, for the vessels were within 100 yards of each other. The scene which took place in the cabin exhibited a lascivious brutality. The sick officer, Mr. Gibson, was dragged from his berth, the clothes of the other passengers stripped from their backs, and the whole of the cabin passengers driven on deck, except the females, whom they locked up in the round house on deck, and the steward, who was detained to serve the pirates with wine and eatables. His treatment no doubt hastened the death of Gibson. The unfortunate gentleman did not long survive it. As the passengers were forced up the cabin ladder, the feelings of Major Logie, it may be imagined, were of the most heart-rending description. In vain did he entreat to be allowed to remain. He was hurried away from even the chance of protecting his defenseless wife, and battened down with the rest in the hold, there to be racked with the fearful apprehensions of their almost certain doom. The labors of the robbers being now concluded, they sat down to regale themselves, preparatory to the chef d'oeuvre of their diabolical enterprise; and a more terrible group of demi-devils, the steward declares, could not be well imagined than commanded his attention at the cabin table. However, as he was a Frenchman, and naturally polite, he acquitted himself of the office of cupbearer, if not as gracefully, at least as anxiously, as ever did Ganymede herself. Yet, notwithstanding this readiness to serve the visitors in their gastronomic desires, the poor steward felt ill requited. He was twice frightened into an icicle, and twice thawed back into conscious horror, by the rudeness of those he entertained. In one instance, when he had filled out a sparkling glass for a ruffian, and believed he had quite won the heart of the drinker by the act, he found himself grasped roughly and tightly by the throat, and the point of a knife staring him in the face. It seems the fellow who thus seized him had felt between his teeth a sharp bit of broken glass, and fancying that something had been put in the wine to poison him, he determined to prove his suspicions by making the steward swallow what remained in the bottle from which the liquor had been drawn, and thus unceremoniously prefaced his command. However, ready and implicit obedience averted further bad consequences. The other instance of the steward's jeopardy was this. When the repast was ended, one of the gentlemen coolly requested him to waive all delicacy, and point out the place in which the captain's money was concealed. He might as well have asked him to produce the philosopher's stone. However, pleading the truth was of no use. His determined requisitor seconded the demand by snapping a pistol at his breast. Having misfired, he recocked and again presented it, but the fatal weapon was struck aside by Barbazan, who reproved the rashness with a threat, and thus averted the steward's impending fate. It was then, with feeling of satisfaction, he heard himself ordered to go down to the hold, and in a moment he was bolted in among his fellow sufferers. The ruffians indulged in the pleasure of the bottle for some time longer, and then having ordered down the females, treated them with even less humanity than characterized their conduct towards the others. The screams of the helpless females were heard in the hold by those who were unable to render them assistance, and agonizing, indeed, must these screams have been in their incarcerated bearers. How far the brutality of pirates was carried in this stage of the horrid proceedings we can only surmise. Fortunately, their lives were spared, although, as it afterwards appeared, the orders of Soto were to butcher every being on board, and it is thought that those orders were not put into action, in consequence of the villains having wasted so much time in drinking, and otherwise indulging themselves, for it was not until the loud voice of their chief was heard to recall them, that they prepared to leave the ship. They therefore contented themselves with fastening the women within the cabin, heaping heavy lumber on the hatches of the hold, and boring holes in the planks of the vessel below the surface of the water, so that in destroying the unhappy people at one swoop they might make up for the lost time. They then left the ship, sinking fast to her apparently certain fate. It may be reasonably supposed, bad as their conduct was towards the females, and pitiable as was the suffering it produced, that the lives of the whole left to perish were preserved through it, for the ship must have gone down if the women had been either taken out of her or murdered, and those in the hold inevitably have gone with her to the bottom. But by good fortune the females succeeded in forcing their way out of the cabin, and became the means of liberating the men confined in the hold. When they came on deck it was nearly dark, yet they could see the pirate ship at a considerable distance. With all her sails set and bearing away from them, they prudently waited, concealed from the possibility of being seen by the enemy, and when the night fell they crept to the hatchway, and called out to the men below to endeavor to effect their liberation, informing them that the pirate was away and out of sight. They then united their efforts, and the lumber being removed, the hatches gave way to the force below, so that the released captives breathed of hope again. The delightful draught, however, was checked when the ship was found to contain 6 feet of water. A momentary collapse took possession of all their newly excited expectation. Cries and groans of despair burst forth, but the sailors' energy quickly returned and was followed by that of others. They set to work at the pumps, and by dint of labor succeeded in keeping the vessel afloat. Yet to direct her course was impossible, the pirates having completely disabled her, by cutting away her rigging, and sawing the mast all the way through. The eye of Providence, however, was not averted from the hapless people, for they fell in with a vessel next day that relieved them from their distressing situation, and brought them to England in safety. We will now return to Soto, and show how the hand of that Providence that secured his intended victims fell upon himself and his wicked associates. Intoxicated with their infamous success, the night had far advanced before Soto learned that the people in the Morning Star, instead of being slaughtered, were only left to be drowned. The information excited his utmost rage. He reproached Barbazan and those who had accompanied them in the boarding with disobeying his orders, and declared that now there could be no security for their lives. Late as the hour was, and long as he had been steering away from the Morning Star, he determined to put back, in the hope of eventually preventing the escape of those in the devoted vessel by seeing them destroyed before his eyes. Soto was a follower of the principle inculcated by the old maxim, "Dead men tell no tales," and in pursuit of his doctrine lost not a moment in putting about and running back. But it was too late. He could find no trace of the vessel, and so consoled himself with the belief that she was at the bottom of the sea, many fathoms below the keen and cognizance of Admiralty courts. Soto, thus satisfied, bent his course to Europe. On his voyage he fell in with a small brig, boarded, plundered, sunk her, and that he might not again run the hazard of encountering living witnesses of his guilt, murdered the crew, with the exception of one individual, whom he took along with him, on account of his knowledge of the course to Corunna, whither he intended to proceed. But faithful to his principle of self-protection, as soon as he had made full use of the unfortunate sailor, and found himself in sight of the destined port, he came up to him at the helm, which he held in his hand. "My friend," said he, "is that the harbor of Corunna?" "Yes," was the reply. "Then," rejoined Soto, "you have done your duty well, and I am obliged to you for your services." On the instant he drew a pistol and shot the man, then coolly flung his body overboard, took the helm himself, and steered into his native harbor as little concerned if he had returned from an honest voyage. At this port he obtained papers in a false name, disposed of a great part of his booty, and after a short stay set out for Cadiz, where he expected a market for the remainder. He had a fair wind until he came within sight of the coast near that city. It was coming on dark, and he lay to, expecting to go into his anchorage next morning. But the wind shifted to the westward, and suddenly began to blow a heavy gale. It was right on the land. He luffed his ship as close to the wind as possible, in order to clear a point that stretched outward, and beat off to windward, but his lee way carried him towards the land, and he was caught when he least expected the trap. The gale increased, the night grew pitchy dark, the roaring breakers were on his lee beam, the drifting vessel strikes, rebounds, and strikes again. The cry of horror rings through the flapping cordage, and despair is in the eyes of the demon crew. Helpless they lie amid the wraths of the storm, and darkened face of heaven, for the first time, strikes terror on their guilty hearts. Death is before them, but not with a merciful quickness does he approach. Hour after hour the frightful vision glares upon them, and at length disappears only to come upon them again in a more dreadful form. The tempest abates, and the sinners were spared for the time. As the daylight broke, they took to their boats, and abandoned the vessel to preserve their lives. But there was no repentance in the pirates. Along with the night and the winds went the voice of conscience, and they thought no more of what had passed. They stood upon the beach gazing at the wreck, and the first thought of Soto was to sell it, and purchase another vessel for the renewal of his atrocious pursuits. With a marked decision of his character, he proposed his intention to his followers, and received their full approbation. The plan was instantly arranged. They were to present themselves as honest, shipwrecked mariners to the authorities at Cadiz. Soto was to take upon himself the office of mate, or contramaestre, to an imaginary captain, and thus obtain their sanction in disposing of the vessel. In their assumed character, the whole proceeded to Cadiz, and presented themselves before the proper officers of the marine. Their story was listened to with sympathy, and for a few days everything went on their satisfaction. Soto had succeeded so well as to conclude the sale of the wreck with a broker. For the sum of $1,750 the contract was signed, but fortunately the money was not yet paid, when suspicion arose from some inconsistencies in the pirates' account of themselves, and 6 of them were arrested by the authorities. Soto and one of his crew instantly disappeared from Cadiz, and succeeded in arriving at the neutral ground before Gibraltar, and 6 more made their escape to the Caracas. None are permitted to enter the fortress of Gibraltar without permission from the governor, or a passport. Soto and his companion, therefore, took up their quarters at a posada on the neutral ground, and resided there in security for several days. The busy and daring mind of the former could not long remain inactive. He proposed to his companion to attempt to enter the garrison in disguise and by stealth, but could not avail upon him to consent. He therefore resolved to go in alone, and his object in doing so was to procure a supply of money by a letter of credit, which he brought with him from Cadiz. His companion, more wise than he, chose the safer course. He knew that the neutral ground was not much controllable by the laws either of the Spanish or the English, and although there was not much probability of being discovered, he resolved not to trust to chance in so great a stake as his life, and he proved to have been right in his judgment, for had he gone to Gibraltar, he would have shared the same fate of his chief. This man is the only one of the whole gang who had not met with the punishment of his crimes, for he succeeded in effecting his escape on board some vessel. It is not even suspected to what country he is gone, but his description, no doubt, is registered. The steward of the Morning Star informed me that he is a tall, stout man, with fair hair and fresh complexion, of a mild and gentle countenance, but that he was one of the worst villains of the whole piratical crew. I believe he is stated to be a Frenchman. Soto secured his admission into the garrison by a false pass, and took up his residence at an inferior tavern in a narrow lane which runs off the main street of Gibraltar, and is kept by a man by the name of Basso. The appearance of his house suits well with the associations of the worthy Benito's life. I have occasion to pass the door frequently at night, for our barrack, the casement, is but a few yards from it. I never look at the place without feeling an involuntary sensation of horror. The smoky and dirty nooks, the distant groups of dark Spaniards, Moors, and Jews, their shallow countenances made yellow by the fight of dim oil lamps, the unceiled rafters of the room above, seen through unshuttered windows, and the consciousness of their having covered the atrocious Soto, combined this effect upon me. In this den the villain remained for a few weeks, and during this time seemed to enjoy himself, as if he had never committed a murder. The story he told Basso of his circumstances was, that he had come to Gibraltar on his way to Cadiz from Malaga, and were merely awaiting the arrival of a friend. He dressed expensively, generally wore a white hat of the best English quality, silk stockings, white trousers, and blue frock coat. His whiskers were large and bushy, and his hair, which was very black, profuse, long, and naturally curled, was much in the style of a London preacher of prophetic and anti-poetic notoriety. He was deeply browned with the sun, and had an air and gait expressive of his bold, enterprising, and desperate mind. Indeed, when I saw him in his cell and at his trial, although his frame was attenuated almost to a skeleton, the colour of his face a pale yellow, his eyes sunken, and hair closely shorn, he still exhibited strong traces of what he had been; still retained his erect and fearless carriage, his quick, fiery, malevolent eyes, his hurried and concise speech, and his close and pertinent style of remark. He appeared to me such a man as would have made a hero in the ranks of his country, had circumstances placed him in the proper road to fame. But ignorance and poverty turned into the most ferocious robber, one who might have rendered service and been an honour to his sunken country. I should like to hear what the phrenologists say of his head. It appears to me to be the most peculiar I had ever seen, and certainly, as far as the bump of destructiveness went, bore the theory fully out. It is rumoured here that the skull has been sent to the savants of Edinburgh. If this is the case, we shall no doubt be made acquainted with their sage opinions upon the subject, and great conquerors will receive a further assurance of how much they resemble in their physical nature the greatest murderers. When I visited the pirate in the Moorish castle where he was confined, he was sitting in his cold, narrow, miserable cell upon a pallet of straw, eating his coarse meal from a tin plate. I thought him more an object of pity than vengeance. He looked so worn with disease, so crushed with suffering, yet so affable, frank, and kind in his address, for he had happened to be in a communicative mood, a thing that was by no means common with him. He spoke of his long confinement, till I thought the tears were about to start from his eyes, and alluded to his approaching trial with satisfaction. But his predominant characteristic, ferocity, appeared in his small piercing black eyes before I left him, as he alluded to his keeper, the provost, in such a way that made me suspect his desire for blood was not yet extinguished. When he appeared in court on his trial, his demeanour was quite altered. He seemed to me to have suddenly risen out of the wretch he was in his cell, to all the qualities I had heard of him. He stood erect and unembarrassed. He spoke with a strong voice, attended closely to the proceedings, occasionally examined the witnesses, and at the conclusion protested against the justice of his trial. He sometimes spoke to the guards around him, and sometimes affected an air of carelessness of his awful situation, which, however, did not sit easy upon him. Even here the leading trait of his mind broke forth, for when the interpreter commenced his office, the language which he made use of being pedantic and affected, Soto interrupted him thus, while a scowl sat upon his brow that terrified the man of words: "I don't understand you, man. Speak Spanish like others, and I'll listen to you." When the dirk that belonged to Mr. Robinson, the trunk and clothes taken from Mr. Gibson, and the pocket book containing the ill-fated captain's handwriting were placed before him, and proved to have been found in his room, and when the maid servant of the tavern proved that she found the dirk under his pillow every morning on arranging his bed, and when he was confronted with his own black slave between two wax lights, the countenance of the villain appeared in its true nature, not depressed nor sorrowful, but vivid and ferocious; and when the patient and dignified governor, Sir George Donne, passed the judge's sentence of the law upon him, he looked daggers at his heart, and assumed a hard silence, more eloquent than words. The criminal persisted up to the day before his execution in asserting his innocence, and inveighing against the injustice of his trial; but the certainty of his fate, and the awful voice of religion, at length subdued him. He made an unreserved confession of his guilt, and became truly penitent; gave up to the keeper the blade of a razor which he had secreted between the soles of his shoes for the acknowledged purpose of adding suicide to his crimes, and seemed to wish for the moment that was to send him before his Creator. I witnessed his execution, and I believe there never was a more contrite man than he appeared to be; yet there was no drivelling fears upon him. He walked firmly at the tail of the fatal cart, gazing sometimes at his coffin, sometimes at the crucifix which he held in his hand. The symbol of divinity he frequently pressed to his lips, repeated the prayers spoken in his ear by the attendant clergyman, and seemed regardless of every thing but the world to come. The gallows were erected beside the water, and fronting the neutral ground. He mounted the cart as firmly as he had walked behind it, and held up his face to heaven in the beating rain, calm, resigned, but unshaken. And finding the halter too high for his neck, he boldly stepped upon his coffin, and placed his head in the noose. Then watching the first turns of the wheels, he murmured, "Adios todos," farewell all, and leaned forward to facilitate his fall. The black slave of the pirate stood upon the battery trembling before his dying master to behold the awful termination of a series of events, the recital of which to his African countrymen, when he shall return to his home, will give them no doubt a dreadful picture of European civilization. The black boy was acquitted at Cadiz, but the men who had fled to the Caracas, as well as those arrested after the wreck, were convicted, executed, their limbs severed, and hung on tenterhooks as a warning to all pirates. End of chapter 9. Recording by Ben Wilford of Jackson, Tennessee.
Of the Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian von Diedenroth. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Section 10. The Adventures of Captain Robert Kidd. The easy access to the harbor of New York, the number of hiding places about its waters, and the laxity of its newly organized government about the year 1695 made it a great rendezvous of pirates, where they might dispose of their booty and concert new depredations. As they brought home with them wealthy lading of all kinds, the luxuries of the tropics, and the sumptuous spoils of the Spanish provinces, and disposed of them with the proverbial carelessness of freebooters, they were welcome visitors to the thrifty traders of New York. Crews of these desperadoes, therefore, the renegades of every country and every clime, might be seen swaggering in open day about the streets, elbowing its quiet inhabitants, trafficking their rich outlandish plunder at half or quarter price to the wary merchant, and then squandering their prize money in taverns, drinking, gambling, singing, carousing, and astounding the neighborhood with midnight brawl and revelry. At length, these excesses rose to such a height as to become a scandal to the provinces, and to call loudly for the interposition of government. Measures were accordingly taken to put a stop to this widely extended evil, and to drive the pirates out of the colonies. Among the distinguished individuals who lurked about the colonies was Captain Robert Kidd. His real name was William Kidd, who in the beginning of King William's War commanded a privateer in the West Indies, and by his several adventurous actions acquired the reputation of a brave man, as well as an experienced seaman. But he had now become notorious as a nondescript animal of the ocean. He was somewhat of a trader, something more of a smuggler, but mostly a pirate. He had traded many years among the pirates in a little rakish vessel that could run into all kinds of water. He knew all their haunts and lurking places, and was always hooking about on mysterious voyages. Upon the good old maxim of setting a rogue to catch a rogue, Captain Kidd was recommended by the Lord Bellamont, then governor of Barbados, as well as by several other persons, to the government here as a person very fit to be entrusted to the command of a government ship, and to be employed in cruising upon the pirates, as knowing those seas perfectly well, and being acquainted with all their lurking places. But what reasons governed the politics of those times I cannot tell. But this proposal met with no encouragement here, though it is certain it would have been of great consequence to the subject, our merchants suffering incredible damages by those robbers. Upon this neglect, the Lord Bellamont, and some others, who knew what great captures had been made by the pirates, and what prodigious wealth must be in their possession, were tempted to fit out a ship at their own private charge, and to give the command of her to Captain Kidd. And to give the thing a greater reputation, as well as to keep their seamen under better command, they procured the king's commission for the said Captain Kidd, of which the following is an exact copy. William Rex, William the Third, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and so on. To our trusty and well-beloved Captain Robert Kidd, commander of the ship the Adventure Galley, or to any other, the commander of the same for the time being, greeting. Whereas we are informed that Captain Thomas II, John Ireland, Captain Thomas Wake, and Captain William Mays or Mace, and other subjects, natives or inhabitants of New York and elsewhere, in our plantations in America, have associated themselves with divers others wicked and ill-disposed persons, and do, against the law of nations, commit many and great piracies, robberies, and depredations on the seas upon the parts of America, and in other parts, to the great hindrance and discouragement of trade and navigation, and to the great danger and hurt of our loving subjects, our allies, and all others, navigating the seas upon their lawful occasions. Now, know ye, that we being desirous to prevent the aforesaid mischiefs, and as much as in us lies, to bring the said pirates, freebooters, and sea rovers to justice, have thought fit, and do hereby give and grant to the said Robert Kidd, to whom our commissions for exercising the office of Lord High Admiral of England have granted a commission as a private man of war, bearing date the 11th day of December, 1695. And unto the commander of said ship for the time being, and unto the officers, mariners, and others which shall be under your command, full power and authority to apprehend, seize, and take into your custody, as well the said Captain Thomas II, John Ireland, Captain Thomas Wake, and Captain William Mays or Mace, as all such pirates, freebooters, and sea rovers, being either our subjects or of other nations associated with them, which you shall meet with upon the seas or coasts of America, or upon any other seas or coasts, which are the ships and vessels, and all such merchandises, money, goods, and wares, as shall be found on board or with them. In any case, they shall willingly yield themselves, but if they will not yield without fighting, then you are by force to compel them to yield. And we also require you to bring or cause to be brought such pirates, freebooters, or sea rovers as you shall seize to a legal trial, to the end they may be proceeded against according to the law in such cases. And we do hereby command all our officers, ministers, and other our loving subjects whatsoever to be aiding and assisting to you in the premises. And we do hereby enjoin you to keep an exact journal of your proceedings in execution of the premises, and set down the names of such pirates, and of their officers and company, and the names of such ships and vessels as you shall by virtue of these presents take and seize, and the quantities of arms, ammunition, provision, and lading of such ships, and the true value of the same, as near as you judge. And we do hereby strictly charge and command you, as you will answer to the contrary, at your peril. that you do not in any manner offend or molest our friends or allies, their ships or subjects, by color or pretense of these presents, or the authority granted. In witness whereof we have caused our great seal of England to be affixed to these presents, given at our court in Kensington, the 26th day of January, 1695, in the 7th year of our reign. Captain Kidd had also another commission, which was called a commission of reprisals. For it being then wartime, this commission was to justify him in the taking of French merchant ships, in case he should meet with any. But as this commission is nothing to our present purpose, we shall not burthen the reader with it. Previous to sailing, Captain Kidd buried his Bible on the seashore, in Plymouth Sound, its divine precepts being so at variance with his wicked course of life that he did not choose to keep a book which condemned him in his lawless career. With these two commissions he sailed out of Plymouth in May, 1696, in the Adventure Galley of 30 guns and 80 men. The place he first designed for was New York. In his voyage thither he took a French banker, but this was no act of piracy, he having a commission for that purpose, as we have just observed. When he arrived at New York, he put up articles for engaging more hands, it being necessary to his ship's crew, since he proposed to deal with a desperate enemy. The terms he offered were that every man should have a share of what was taken, reserving for himself and owners 40 shares, upon which encouragement he soon increased his company to 155 men. With this company he sailed first for Madeira, where he took in wine and some other necessaries. From thence he proceeded to Bonavista, one of the Cape de Verde Islands, to furnish the ship with salt, and from thence went immediately to St. Jago, another of the Cape de Verde Islands, in order to stock himself with provisions. When all this was done, he bent his course to Madagascar, the known rendezvous of pirates. In his way he fell in with Captain Warren, commodore of 3 men of war. He acquainted him with his design, kept them company 2 or 3 days, and then leaving them, made the best of his way for Madagascar, where he arrived in February 1696, just 9 months from his departure from Plymouth. It happened that at this time the pirate ships were most of them out in search of prey, so that according to the best intelligence Captain Kidd could get, there was not one of them at that time about the island. Wherefore, having spent some time in watering his ship, and taking in more provisions, he thought of trying his fortune on the coast of Malabar, where he arrived in the month of June following, 4 months from his reaching Madagascar. Hereabouts he made an unsuccessful cruise, touching sometimes at the island of Mohilla, and sometimes at the Johanna between Malabar and Madagascar. His provisions were every day wasting, and his ship began to want repair. Wherefore, when he was at Johanna, he found means of borrowing a sum of money from some Frenchmen who had lost their ship, but saved their effects, and with this he purchased materials for putting his ship in good repair. It does not appear all this while that he had the least design of turning pirate, for near Mohilla and Johanna both he met with several Indian ships richly laden, to which he did not offer the least violence, though he was strong enough to have done what he pleased with them. And the first outrage or depredation I find he committed upon mankind was after his repairing his ship and leaving Johanna. He touched at a place called Mabi upon the Red Sea, where he took some guinea corn from the natives by force. After this he sailed to Bab's Key, a place upon a little island at the entrance of the Red Sea. Here it was that he first began to open himself to his ship's company, and let them understand that he intended to change his measures, for, happening to talk of the Mocha fleet, which was to sail that way, he said, "We have been unsuccessful hitherto, but courage, my boys, we'll make our fortunes out of this fleet." And finding that none of them appeared averse to it, he ordered a boat out, well manned, to go upon the coast to make discoveries, commanding them to take a prisoner and bring him to him, or get intelligence any way they could. The boat returned in a few days, bringing him word that they saw 14 or 15 ships ready to sail, some with English, some with Dutch, and some with Moorish colors. We cannot account for this sudden change in his conduct, otherwise than by supposing that he first meant well, while he had hopes of making his fortune by taking of pirates, but now, weary of ill success, and fearing lest his owners, out of humor at their great expenses, should dismiss him, and he should want employment, and be marked out for an unlucky man, rather, I say, than run the hazard of poverty, he resolved to do his business one way, since he could not do it another. He therefore ordered a man continually to watch at the masthead, lest this fleet should go by them, and about 4 days later, towards evening, it appeared in sight, being convoyed by 1 English and 1 Dutch man of war. Kidd soon fell in with them, and getting into the midst of them, fired at a Moorish ship which was next him. But the men of war, taking the alarm, bore down upon Kidd, and firing upon him, obliged him to steer off, he not being strong enough to contend with them. Now he had begun hostilities. He resolved to go on, and therefore he went and cruised along the coast of Malabar. The first prize he met was a small vessel belonging to Aden. The vessel was Moorish, and the owners were Moorish merchants. But the master was an Englishman. His name was Parker. Kidd forced him and a Portuguese that was called Don Antonio, which were all the Europeans on board, to take on with him. The first he designed as a pilot, and the last as an interpreter. He also used the men very cruelly, causing them to be hoisted up by the arms and drubbed with a naked cutlass to force them to discover whether they had money on board, and where it lay. But as they had neither gold nor silver on board, he got nothing by his cruelty. However, he took from them a bale of pepper and a bale of coffee, and so let them go. A little time after he touched at Carawar, a place upon the same coast, where before he arrived, the news of what he had done to the Moorish ship had reached them, for some of the English merchants there had received an account of it from the owners, who corresponded with men, wherefore, as soon as Kidd came in, he was suspected to be the person who committed this piracy, and when Mr. Harvey and Mr. Mason, 2 of the English factory, came upon board and asked for Parker and Antonio, the Portuguese. But Kidd denied that he knew any such persons, having secured them both in a private place in the hold, where they were kept for 7 or 8 days, that is, till Kidd sailed from thence. However, the coast was alarmed, and a Portuguese man of war was sent out to cruise. Kidd met with her, and fought her about 6 hours, gallantly enough. But finding her too strong to be taken, he quitted her, for he was able to run away from her when he would. Then he went to a place called Porca, where he watered his ship and bought a number of hogs of the natives to victual his company. Soon after this, he came up with a Moor ship, the master whereof was a Dutchman called Schipper Mitchell, and chased her under French colors, which they, observing, hoisted French colors too. When he came up with her, he hailed her in French, and they, having a Frenchman on board, answered him in the same language, upon which he ordered them to send their boat on board. They were obliged to do so, and having examined who they were, and from whence they came, he asked the Frenchman, who was a passenger, if he had a French pass for himself. The Frenchman gave him to understand that he had. Then he told the Frenchman that he must pass for a captain, and by, says he, you are the captain. The Frenchman durst not refuse doing as he would have him. The meaning of this was, that he would seize the ship as fair prize, and as if she had belonged to French subjects, according to a commission he had for that purpose, though one would think, after what he had already done, he need not have recourse to a quibble to give his actions a color. In short, He took the cargo and sold it some time after, yet he still seemed to have some fears upon him, lest these proceedings should have a bad end, for, coming up with a Dutch ship some time after, when his men thought of nothing but attacking her, Kidd opposed it. Upon which a mutiny arose, and the majority being for taking the said ship, and arming themselves to man the boat to go and seize her, he told them, such as did, never should come on board him again, which put an end to the design, so that he kept company with the said ship some time, without offering her any violence. However, this dispute was the occasion of an accident, upon which an indictment was grounded against Kidd, for Moore, the gunner, being one day upon deck, and talking with Kidd about the said Dutch ship, some words arose between them, and Moore told Kidd that he had ruined them all, upon which Kidd, calling him a dog, took up a bucket and struck him with it, which breaking his skull, he died next day. But Kidd's penitential fit did not last long, for coasting along Malabar, he met with a great number of boats, all of which he plundered. Upon the same coast he also fell in with a Portuguese ship, which he kept possession of a week, and then having taken out of her some chests of India goods, 30 jars of butter, with some wax, iron, and 100 bags of rice, he let her go. Much about the same time he went to one of the Malabar islands for wood and water, and his cooper, being ashore, was murdered by the natives, upon which Kidd himself landed, and burnt and pillaged several of their houses, the people running away, but having taken one, he caused him to be tied to a tree, and commanded one of his men to shoot him. Then putting to sea again, he took the greatest prize which fell into his hands while he followed this trade. This was a Moorish ship of 400 tons, richly laden, named the Queda Merchant, the master whereof was an Englishman, by the name of Wright, for the Indians often make use of English or Dutchmen to command their ships, their own mariners not being so good artists in navigation. Kidd chased her under French colors, and having come up with her, he ordered her to hoist out her boat, and send on board of him, which being done, he told Wright he was his prisoner, and informing himself concerning the said ship, he understood there were no Europeans on board, except 2 Dutch and 1 Frenchman, all the rest being Indians or Armenians, and that the Armenians were part owners of the cargo. Kidd gave the Armenians to understand that if they would offer anything that was worth his taking for their ransom, he would hearken to it, upon which they proposed to pay him 20,000 rupees, not quite £3,000 sterling. But Kidd judged this would be making a bad bargain, wherefore he rejected it, and setting the crew on shore at different places on the coast, he soon sold as much of the cargo as came to £10,000. With part of it he also trafficked, receiving in exchange provisions or such other goods as he wanted. By degrees he disposed of the whole cargo, and when the division was made, it came to about £200 a man, and having reserved 40 shares to himself, his divided amounted to about £8,000 sterling. The Indians along the coast came on board and trafficked with all freedom, and he punctually performed his bargains, till about the time he was ready to sail, and then, thinking he should have no further occasion for them, he made no scruple of taking their goods and setting them on shore, without any payment in money or goods, which they little expected, for as they had been used to deal with pirates, they always found them men of honor in the way of trade, a people enemies to deceit, and that scorned to rob but in their own way. Kidd put some of his men on board the Queda Merchant, and with this ship and his own sailed for Madagascar. As soon as he had arrived and cast anchor, there came on board of him a canoe, in which were several Englishmen, who had formerly been well acquainted with Kidd. As soon as they saw him, they saluted him, and told him they were informed he was come to take them and hang them, which would be a little unkind in such an old acquaintance. Kidd soon dissipated their doubts by swearing he had no such design, and that he was now in every aspect their brother, and just as bad as they, and calling for a cup of bamboo, drank their captain's health. These men belonged to a pirate ship, called the Resolution, formerly the Mocha Merchant, whereof one Captain Culliford was commander, and which lay at anchor not far from them. Kidd went on board with them, promising them his friendship and assistance, and Culliford, in his turn, came on board of Kidd, and Kidd, to testify his sincerity in iniquity, finding Culliford in want of some necessaries, made him a present of an anchor and some guns, to fit him out for sea again. The Adventure galley was now so old and leaky that they were forced to keep 2 pumps continually going, wherefore Kidd shifted all the guns and tackle out of her into the Quedagh Merchant, intending her for his man of war, and as he had divided the money before, he now made a division of the remainder of the cargo, soon after which the greatest part of the company left him, some going on board Captain Culliford, and others absconding into the country, so that he had not above 40 men left. He put to sea, and happened to touch at Amboyna, one of the Dutch Spice Islands, where he was told that the news of his actions had reached England, and that he was there declared a pirate. The truth of it is, his piracy so alarmed our merchants that some motions were made in Parliament to inquire into the commission that was given him and the persons who fitted him out. These proceedings seemed to lean a little hard upon Lord Bellamont, who thought himself so touched thereby that he published a justification of himself in a pamphlet, after Kidd's execution. In the meantime, was thought advisable, in order to stop the course of these piracies, to publish a proclamation, offering the king's free pardon to all such pirates as should voluntarily surrender themselves, whatever piracies they had been guilty of at any time before the last day of April, 1699. That is to say, for all piracies committed eastward of the Cape of Good Hope to the longitude and meridian of Socotora and Cape Cormoran, in which proclamation Avery and Kidd were accepted by name. When Kidd left Amboyna, he knew nothing of this proclamation, for certainly, had he had notice of his being accepted in it, he would not have been so infatuated as to run himself into the very jaws of danger, but relying upon his interest with the Lord Bellamont, and fancying that a French pass or 2 he found on board some of the ships he took would serve to countenance the matter, and that part of the booty he got would gain him new friends, I say all these things made him flatter himself that all would be hushed, and that justice would but wink at him. Wherefore he sailed directly for Boston laden with booty, with a crew of swaggering companions at his heels. But no sooner did he show himself in Boston than the alarm was given of his reappearance, and measures were taken to arrest him. The daring character which Kidd had acquired, however, and the desperate fellows who followed like bulldogs at his heels, caused a little delay in his arrest. He took advantage of this to bury the greater part of his immense treasure, which has never been found, and then carried a high head about the streets of Boston. He even attempted to defend himself when arrested, but was secured and thrown into prison. Such was the formidable character of this pirate and his crew, that a frigate was sent to convey them to England for trial. Accordingly, a sessions of Admiralty being held at the Old Bailey in May 1701, Captain Kidd, Nicholas Churchill, James Howe, Robert Lumley, William Jenkins, Gabriel Loff, Hugh Parrott, Richard Barleycorn, Abel Owens, and Darby Mullins were arraigned for piracy and robbery on the high seas, and all found guilty except 3. These were Robert Lumley, William Jenkins, and Richard Barleycorn, who, proving themselves to be apprentices to some of the officers of the ship, and producing their indentures in court, were acquitted. The three above mentioned, though they were proved to be concerned in taking and sharing the ship and goods mentioned in the indictment, yet, as the gentleman of the long robe rightly distinguished, there was a great difference between their circumstances and the rest. For there must go an intention of the mind and a freedom of the will to the committing an act of felony or piracy. A pirate is not to be understood to be under constraint, but a free agent. For in this case, the bare act will not make a man guilty, unless the will make it so. Now a servant, it is true, if he go voluntarily, and have his proportion, he must be accounted a pirate, for then he acts upon his own account, and not by compulsion. And these persons, according to the evidence, received their part, but whether they accounted to their masters for their shares afterwards is the matter in question. And what distinguishes them as free agents, or men that did go under the compulsion of their masters, which being left to the consideration of the jury, they found them not guilty. Kidd was tried upon an indictment of murder also, viz. For killing Moore the gunner, and found guilty of the same. Nicholas Churchill and James Howe pleaded the king's pardon, as having surrendered themselves within the time limited in the proclamation, and Colonel Bass, governor of West Jersey, to whom they surrendered, being in court, and called upon, proved the same. However, this plea was overruled by the court, because there being 4 commissioners named in the proclamation, viz. Captain Thomas Warren, Israel Hayes, Peter Delanoy, and Christopher Pollard, esquires, who were appointed commissioners and sent over on purpose to receive the submissions of such pirates as should surrender, it was adjudged no other person was qualified to receive their surrender, and that they could not be entitled to the benefit of the said proclamation because they had not in all circumstances complied with the conditions of it. Darby Mullins urged in his defense that he served under the king's commission, and therefore could not disobey his commander without incurring great punishments. That whenever a ship or ships went out upon any expedition under the king's commission, the men were never allowed to call their officers to an account. Why they did this, or why they did that, because such a liberty would destroy all discipline. That if anything was done which was unlawful, the officers were to answer for it, for the men did no more than their duty in obeying orders. He was told by the court that acting under the commission justified in what was lawful, but not in what was unlawful. He answered, he stood in need of nothing to justify him in what was lawful. But the case of seamen must be very hard, if they must be brought in such danger for obeying the commands of their officers, and punished for not obeying them, and if they were allowed to dispute the orders, there could be no such thing as command kept at sea. This seemed to be the best defense the thing could bear, but his taking a share of the plunder, the seamen's mutinying on board several times, and taking upon them to control the captain, showed there was no obedience paid to the commission, and that they acted in all things according to the custom of pirates and freebooters, which weighing with the jury, they brought him in guilty with the rest. As to Captain Kidd's defense, he insisted much on his own innocence, and the villainy of his men. He said he went out in a laudable employment, and had no occasion, being then in good circumstances, to go a-pirating. That the men often mutinied against him, and did as they pleased, that he was threatened to be shot in the cabin, and that 95 left him at once, and set fire to his boat, so that he was disabled from bringing his ship home, or the prizes he took, to have them regularly condemned, which he said were taken by virtue of a commission under the broad seal, they having French passes. The captain called one Colonel Hewson to his reputation, who gave him an extraordinary character, and declared to the court that he had served under his command, and been in 2 engagements with him against the French, in which he fought as well as any man he ever saw, that there were only Kidd's ship and his own against Monsieur de Casse, who commanded a squadron of 6 sail, and they got the better of him. But this being several years before the facts mentioned in the indictment were committed, proved of no manner of service to the prisoner on his trial. As to the friendship shown to Culliford, a notorious pirate, Kidd denied and said he intended to have taken him, but his men being a parcel of rogues and villains, refused to stand by him, and several of them ran away from his ship to the said pirate. But the evidence being full and particular against him, he was found guilty as before mentioned. When Kidd was asked what he had said to say why sentence should not pass against him, he answered that he had nothing to say, but that he had been sworn against by perjured and wicked people. And when sentence was pronounced, he said, "My lord, it is a very hard sentence. For my part, I am the most innocent person of them all. Only I have been sworn against by perjured persons." Wherefore, about a week after, Captain Kidd, Nicholas Churchill, James Howe, Gabriel Loff, Hugh Parrott, Abel Owen, and Darby Mullins were executed at Execution Dock, and afterwards hung up in chains at some distance from each other down the river, where their bodies hung exposed for many years. Kidd died hard, for the rope with which he was first tied up broke with his weight, and he tumbled to the ground. He was tied up a second time, and more effectually. Hence came the story of Kidd's being twice hung. Such is Captain Kidd's true story, but it has given birth to an innumerable progeny of traditions. The report of his having buried great treasures of gold and silver, which he actually did before his arrest, set the brains of all the good people along the coast in a ferment. There were rumors on rumors of great sums of money found here and there, sometimes in one part of the country, sometimes in another, of coins with Moorish inscriptions, doubtless the spoils of his eastern prizes. Some reported the treasure to have been buried in solitary, unsettled places about Plymouth and Cape Cod, but by degrees various other parts, not only on the eastern coast, but along the shores of the Sound, and even Manhattan and Long Island, were gilded by these rumors. In fact, the vigorous measures of Lord Bellomont had spread sudden consternation among the pirates in every part of the provinces. They had secreted their money and jewels in lonely, out-of-the-way places, about the wild shores of the sea-coast, and dispersed themselves over the country. The hand of justice prevented many of them from ever returning to regain their buried treasures, which remain to this day thus secreted and are irrecoverably lost. This is the cause of those frequent reports of trees and rocks bearing mysterious marks, supposed to indicate the spots where treasure lay hidden. And many have been the ransackings after the pirates' booty. A rocky place on the shores of Long Island, called Kidd's Ledge, has received great attention from the money diggers, but they have not as yet discovered any treasures. End of Section 10. Recording by Brian von Diedenroth. www.vondedenroth.com.
Of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 11. The bloody career and execution of Vincent Benavides, a pirate on the west coast of South America. Vincent Benavides was the son of the Gallier of Quirihue in the district of Conception. He was a man of ferocious manners, and had been guilty of several murders. Upon the breaking out of the Revolutionary War, he entered the Patriot army as a private soldier, and was a sergeant of grenadiers at the time of the first Chilean Revolution. He, however, deserted to the Spaniards, and was taken prisoner in their service, when they sustained on the plains of Maypo on the 5th of April, 1818, that defeat which decided their fortunes in that part of America and secured the independence of Chile. Benavides, his brother, and some other traitors to the Chilean cause were sentenced to death and brought forth in the plaza, or public square of Santiago, in order to be shot. Benavides, though terribly wounded by the discharge, was not killed, but he had the presence of mind to counterfeit death in so perfect a manner that the imposture was not suspected. The bodies of the traitors were not buried, but dragged away to a distance, and there left to be devoured by the gallinazos, or vultures. The sergeant who had the superintendence of this part of the ceremony had a personal hatred to Benavides, on account of that person having murdered some of his relations, and to gratify his revenge he drew his sword and gave the dead body, as he thought, a severe gash in the side as they were dragging it along. The resolute Benavides had the fortitude to bear this also, without flinching or even showing the least indication of life, and one cannot help regretting that so determined a power of endurance had not been turned to a better purpose. Benavides lay like a dead man in the heap of carcasses until it became dark, and then, pierced with shot and gashed by the sword as he was, he crawled to a neighboring cottage, the inhabitants of which received him with the greatest kindness and attended him with the greatest care. The daring ruffian, who knew the value of his own talents and courage, being aware that General San Martin was planning the expedition to Peru, a service in which there would be much of desperation and danger, sent word to the general that he was alive, and invited him to a secret conference at midnight, in the same plaza in which it was believed Benavides had been shot. The signal agreed upon was, that they should strike fire 3 times with their flints, as that was not likely to be answered by any but the proper party, and yet was not calculated to awaken suspicion. San Martin, alone, and provided with a brace of pistols, met the desperado, and after a long conference it was agreed that Benavides should, in the meantime, go out against the Arakan Indians, but that he should hold himself in readiness to proceed to Peru, when the expedition suited. Having procured the requisite passports, he proceeded to Chile, where, having again diverted the Chileans, he succeeded in persuading the commander of the Spanish troops that he had force sufficient to carry on the war against Chile, and the commander in consequence retired to Valdivia, and left Benavides commander of the whole frontier on the Biobio. Having thus cleared the coast of the Spanish commander, he went over to the Arakans, or rather he formed a band of armed robbers who committed every cruelty, and were guilty of every perfidy in the south of Chile. Wherever Benavides came, his footsteps were marked with blood, and the old men, the women, and the children were butchered, lest they should give notice of his motions. When he had rendered himself formidable by land, he resolved to be equally powerful upon the sea. He equipped a corsair with instructions to capture the vessels of all nations, and as Arucan is directly opposite the island of Santa Maria, where vessels put in for refreshment after having doubled Cape Horn, his situation was well adapted for his purpose. He was but too successful. The first of his prizes was the American ship Hero, which he took by surprise in the night. The second was the Herculia, a brig belonging to the same country. While the unconscious crew were proceeding, as usual, to catch seals on this island, lying about 3 leagues from the mainland of Aruca, an armed body of men rushed from the woods, and overpowering them, tied their hands behind them, and left them under a guard on the beach. These were no other than the pirates, who now took the Herculia's own boats, and going on board surprised the captain and 4 of his crew, who had remained to take care of the brig, and having brought off the prisoners from the beach, threw them all into the hold, closing the hatches over them. They then tripped the vessel's anchor, and sailing over in triumph to Aruca, were received by Benavides, with a salute of musketry fired under the Spanish flag, which it was their chief's pleasure to hoist on that day. In the course of the next night, Benavides ordered the captain and his crew to be removed to a house on shore, at some distance from the town, then taking them out, one by one, he stripped and pillaged them of all they possessed, threatening them the whole time with drawn swords and loaded muskets. Next morning he paid the prisoners a visit and ordered them to the capital, called together the principal people of the town, and desired each to select one as a servant. The captain and 4 others not happening to please the fancy of any one, Benavides, after saying he would himself take charge of the captain, gave directions, on pain of instant death, that some one should hold themselves responsible for the other prisoners. Some days after this they were called together, and required to serve as soldiers in the pirates' army, an order to which they consented, knowing well by what they had already seen that the consequence of refusal would be fatal. Benavides, though unquestionably a ferocious savage, was, nevertheless, a man of resource, full of activity and of considerable energy of character. He converted the whale spears and harpoons into lances for his cavalry and halberts for his sergeants, and out of the sails he made trousers for half of his army. The carpenters he set to work making baggage carts and repairing his boats. The armorers he kept perpetually at work, mending muskets and making pikes, managing in this way to turn the skill of every one of his prisoners to some useful account. He treated the officers too not unkindly, allowed them to live in his house, and was very anxious on all occasions to have their advice respecting the equipment of his troops. Upon one occasion, when walking with the captain of the Herculia, he remarked that his army was now almost complete in every respect, except in one essential particular, and it cut him, he said, to the soul, to think of such a deficiency. He had no trumpets for his cavalry, and added that it was utterly impossible to make the fellows believe themselves dragoons, unless they heard a blast in their ears at every turn, and neither men nor horses would ever do their duty properly, if not roused to it by the sound of a trumpet. In short, he declared, some device must be hit upon to supply this equipment. The captain, willing to ingratiate himself with the pirate, after a little reflection, suggested to him that trumpets might easily be made of copper sheets on the bottoms of the vessels he had taken. "Very true," cried the delighted chief. "How came I not to think of that before?" Instantly all hands were employed in ripping off the copper, and the armorers being set to work under his personal superintendence, the whole camp, before night, resounded with the warlike blasts of the cavalry. The captain of the ship, who had given him the brilliant idea of the copper trumpets, had by these means so far won upon his good will and confidence as to be allowed a considerable range to walk on. He, of course, was always looking out for some plan of escape, and at length an opportunity occurring, he, with the mate of the Ocean and 9 of his crew, seized 2 whaleboats, imprudently left on the banks of the river, and rowed off. Before quitting the shore, they took the precaution of staving all the other boats, to prevent pursuit, and accordingly, though their escape was immediately discovered, they succeeded in getting so much the start of the people whom Benavides sent in pursuit of them, that they reached St. Mary's Island in safety. Here they caught several seals, upon which they subsisted very miserably till they reached Valparaiso. It was in consequence of their report of Benavides' proceedings, made to Sir Thomas Hardy, the commander-in-chief, that he deemed it proper to send a ship to rescue, if possible, the remaining unfortunate captives at Aruca. Benavides having manned the Herculia, it suited the mate, the captain and crew being detained as hostages, to sail with the brig to Chile, and seek aid from the Spanish governor. The Herculia returned with a 24-pounder, 2 field pieces, 11 Spanish officers, and 20 soldiers, together with the most flattering letters and congratulations to the worthy ally of his most Catholic Majesty. Soon after this he captured the Perseverance, English whaler, and the American brig Ocean, bound for Lima, with several thousand stand of arms on board. The captain of the Herculia, with the mate of the Ocean, and several men, after suffering great hardships, landed at Valparaiso, and gave notice of the proceedings of Benavides, and in consequence Sir Thomas Hardy directed Captain Hall to proceed to Aruca with the convoy, to set the captives free if possible. It was for the accomplishment of this service that Captain Hall sailed from Valparaiso, and he called at Conception on his way, in order to glean information respecting the pirate. Here the captain ascertained that Benavides was between 2 considerable bodies of Chilean force, on the Chilean side of the Biobio, and one of those bodies between him and the river. Having to wait 2 days at Conception for information, Captain Hall occupied them in observing the place. The country he describes as green and fertile, and having none of the dry and desert character of the environs of Valparaiso. Abundance of vegetables, wood, and also coals are found on the shores of the bay. On the 12th of October the captain heard of the defeat of Benavides, and his flight, alone, across the Biobio into the Araucan country, and also that 2 of the Americans whom he had taken with him had made their escape and were on board the Chacabuco. As these were the only persons who could give Captain Hall information respecting the prisoners of whom he was in quest, he set out in search of the vessel, and after 2 days' search found her at anchor near the island of Mocha. From thence he learned that the captain of the Ocean, with several English and American seamen, had been left at Arauca when Benavides went on his expedition, and he sailed for that place immediately. He was too late, however. The Chilean forces had already made a successful attack, and the Indians had fled, setting fire to the town and the ships. The Indians, who were in league with the Chileans, were every way as wild as those who arrayed themselves under Benavides. Captain Hall, upon his return to Conception, though dissuaded from it by the governor, visited the Indian encampment. When the captain and his associates entered the courtyard, they observed a party seated on the ground, round a great tub of wine, who hailed their entrance with loud shouts, or rather yells, and boisterously demanded their business, to all appearance very little pleased with the interruption. The interpreter became alarmed, and wished them to retire, but this the captain thought imprudent, as each man had his long spear close at hand, resting against the eaves of the house. Had they attempted to escape, they must have been taken, or possibly sacrificed, by these drunken savages. As their best chance seemed to lie in treating them without any show of distrust, they advanced to the circle with a good-humoured confidence, which appeased them considerably. One of the party rose and embraced them in the Indian fashion, which they had learned from the gentlemen who had been prisoners with Benavides. After the ceremony they roared out to them to sit down on the ground, and with the most boisterous hospitality insisted on their drinking with them, a request which they cheerfully complied with. Their anger soon vanished, and was succeeded by mirth and satisfaction, which speedily became as outrageous as their displeasure had been at first. Seizing a favourable opportunity, Captain Hall stated his wish to have an interview with their chief, upon which a message was sent to him, but he did not think fit to show himself for a considerable time, during which they remained with the party round the tub, who continued swilling their wine like so many hogs. Their heads soon became affected, and their obstreperous mirth increasing every minute, the situation of the strangers became by no means agreeable. At length Peneleo's door opened, and the chief made his appearance. He did not condescend, however, to cross the threshold, but leaned against the doorpost to prevent falling, being by some degrees more drunk than any of his people. A more finished picture of a savage cannot be conceived. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a prodigiously large head, and a square-shaped, bloated face, from which peeped out 2 very small eyes, partly hid by an immense superfluity of black, coarse, oily straight hair, covering his cheeks, hanging over his shoulders, and rendering his head somewhat the shape and size of a beehive. Over his shoulders was thrown a poncho of coarse blanket stuff. He received them very gruffly, and appeared irritated and sulky at having been disturbed. He was still more offended when he learned that they wished to see his captive. They in vain endeavoured to explain their real views, but he grunted out his answer in a tone and manner which showed them plainly that he neither did nor wished to understand them. Whilst in conversation with Peneleo, they stole an occasional glance at his apartment. By the side of the fire burning in the middle of the floor was seated a young Indian woman, with long black hair reaching to the ground. This, they conceived, could be no other than one of the unfortunate persons they were in search of, and they were somewhat disappointed to observe that the lady was neither in tears nor apparently very miserable. They therefore came away impressed with the unsentimental idea that the amiable Peneleo had already made some impression on her young heart. 2 Indians, who were not so drunk as the rest, followed them to the outside of the court, and told them that several foreigners had been taken by the Chileans in the battle near Chilean, and were now safe. The interpreter hinted to them that this was probably invented by these cunning people on hearing their questions in the court, but he advised them, as a matter of policy, to give them each a piece of money, and to get away as far as they could. Captain Hall returned to Conception on the 23rd of October, reached Valparaiso on the 26th, and in 2 weeks thereafter the men of whom he was in search made their appearance. The bloody career of Benavides now drew near to a close. The defeat on the Chilean side of the Biobio and the burning of Arouca with the loss of his vessels, he never recovered. At length, in the end of December 1821, discovering the miserable state to which he was reduced, he entreated the Intendant of Conception that he might be received on giving himself up along with his partisans. This generous chief accepted his offer, and informed the supreme government; but in the meantime Benavides embarked in a launch at the mouth of the river Lebo and fled, with the intention of joining a division of the enemy's army, which he supposed to be at some one of the ports on the south coast of Peru. It was indeed absurd to expect any good faith from such an intriguer, for in his letters at this time he offered his services to Chile and promised fidelity, while his real intention was still to follow the enemy. He finally left the unhappy province of Conception, the theatre of so many miserable scenes, overwhelmed with the misery which he had caused, without ever recollecting that it was in that province that he had first drawn his breath. His despair in the boat made his conduct insupportable to those who accompanied him, and they rejoiced when they were obliged to put into the harbour of Topocalma in search of water of which they had run short. He was now arrested by some patriotic individuals. From the notorious nature of his crimes alone, even the most impartial stranger would have condemned him to the last punishment. But the supreme government wished to hear what he had to say for himself, and ordered him to be tried according to the laws. It appearing on his trial that he had placed himself beyond the laws of society, such punishment was awarded him as any one of his crimes deserved. As a pirate he merited death, and as a destroyer of whole towns it became necessary to put him to death in such a manner as might satisfy outraged humanity, and terrify others who should dare to imitate him. In pursuance of the sentence passed upon him, he was dragged from the prison in a pannier tied to the tail of a mule, and was hanged in the great square. His head and hands were afterwards cut off, in order to their being placed upon high poles, to point out the places of his horrid crimes, Santa Juana, Tarpalanca, and Arouca. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 12. The Life of Captain Davis, with an account of his surprising the fort at Gambia. Davis was born in Monmouthshire, and from a boy trained to the sea. His last voyage from England was in the sloop Cadogan from Bristol, in the character of chief mate. This vessel was captured by the pirate England upon the Guinea coast, whose companions plundered the crew and murdered the captain, as is related in England's Life. Upon the death of Captain Skinner, Davis pretended that he was urged by England to become a pirate, but that he resolutely refused. He added that England, pleased with his conduct, had made him captain in room of Skinner, giving him a sealed paper which he was not to open until he was in a certain latitude, and then expressly to follow the given directions. When he arrived at the appointed place, he collected the whole crew, and solemnly read his sealed instructions, which contained a generous grant of the ship and all her stores to Davis and his crew, requesting them to go to Brazil and dispose of the cargo to the best advantage, and make an equal division of the money. Davis then commanded the crew to signify whether they were inclined to follow that mode of life, when, to his astonishment and chagrin, the majority positively refused. Then, in a transport of rage, he desired them to go where they would. Knowing that part of the cargo was consigned to merchants in Barbados, they directed their course to that place. When arrived there, they informed the merchants of the unfortunate death of Skinner, and of the proposal which had been made to them. Davis was accordingly seized and committed to prison, but he having never been in the pirate's service, nothing could be proved to condemn him, and he was discharged without a trial. Convinced that he could never hope for employment in that quarter after this detection, he went to the island of Providence, which he knew to be a rendezvous for pirates. Upon his arrival there, he was grievously disappointed, because the pirates who frequented that place had just accepted of his Majesty's pardon, and had surrendered. Captain Rogers, having equipped 2 sloops for trade, Davis obtained employment in one of these, called the Buck. They were laden with European goods to a considerable value, which they were to sell or exchange with the French and Spanish. They first touched at the island of Martinique, belonging to the French, and Davis, knowing that many of the men were formerly in the pirates' service, enticed them to seize the master, and to run off with the sloop. When they had effected their purpose, they hailed the other ship, in which they knew that there were many hands ripe for rebellion, and, coming to, the greater part joined Davis. Those who did not choose to adhere to them were allowed to remain in the other sloop and continue their course, after Davis had pillaged her of what things he pleased. In full possession of the vessel, and stores and goods, a large bowl of punch was made. Under its exhilarating influence it was proposed to choose a commander, and to form their future mode of policy. The election was soon over, and a large majority of legal votes were in favor of Davis, and, no scrutiny demanded, Davis was declared duly elected. He then drew up a code of laws to which he himself swore, and required the same bond of alliance from the rest of the crew. He then addressed them in a short and appropriate speech, the substance of which was a proclamation of war with the whole world. They next consulted what part would be most convenient to clean the vessel, and it was resolved to repair to Coxon's Hole, at the east end of the island of Cuba, where they could remain in perfect security, as the entrance was so narrow that one ship could keep out 100. They, however, had no small difficulty in cleaning their vessel, as there was no carpenter among them. They performed that laborious task in the best manner they could, and then made to the north side of Hispaniola. The first sail they met with was a French ship of 12 guns, which they captured, and while they were plundering her, another appeared in view. Inquiring of the Frenchmen, they learned that she was a ship of 24 guns and 60 men. Davis proposed to his crew to attack her, assuring them that she would prove a rich prize. This appeared to the crew such a hazardous enterprise that they were rather adverse to the measure, but he acquainted them that he had conceived a stratagem that he was confident would succeed. They might, therefore, safely leave the matter to his management. He then commenced chase, and ordered his prize to do the same. Being a better sailor, he soon came up with the enemy, and showed his black colors. With no small surprise at his insolence in coming so near them, they commanded him to strike. He replied that he was disposed to give them employment until his companion came up, who was able to contend with them. Meanwhile, assuring them that, if they did not strike to him, it would most certainly fare the worse for them, then giving them a broadside, he received the same in return. When the other pirate ship drew near, they, according to the directions of Davis, appeared upon decks in white shirts, which making an appearance of numbers, the Frenchmen were intimidated, and struck. Davis ordered the captain with 20 of his men to come on board, and they were all put in irons except the captain. He then dispatched 4 of his men to the other ship, and calling aloud to them, desired that his compliments should be given to the captain, with a request to send a sufficient number of hands to go on board their new prize, to see what they had got in her. At the same time he gave them a written paper with their proper instructions, even to nail up the small guns, to take out all the arms and powder, and to go every man on board the new prize. When his men were on board her, he ordered the greater part of the prisoners to be removed into the empty vessels, and by this means secured himself from any attempt to recover their ship. During 3 days, these 3 vessels sailed in company, but finding that his late prize was a heavy sailer, he emptied her of everything that he stood in need of, and then restored her to the captain with all his men. The French captain was so much enraged at being thus miserably deceived, that upon the discovery of this stratagem he would have thrown himself overboard, had not his men prevented him. Captain Davis then formed the resolution of parting with the other prize ship also, and soon afterwards steered northward and took a Spanish sloop. He next directed his course towards the Western Islands, and from Cape de Verde Islands cast anchor at St. Nicholas, and hoisted English colors. The Portuguese supposed that he was a privateer, and Davis, going on shore, was hospitably received, and they traded with him for such articles as they found most advantageous. He remained here 5 weeks, and he and half of his crew visited the principal town of the island. Davis, from his appearing in the dress of a gentleman, was greatly caressed by the Portuguese, and nothing was spared to entertain and render him and his men happy. Having amused themselves during a week, they returned to the ship, and allowed the other half of the crew to visit the capital and enjoy themselves in like manner. Upon their return, they cleaned their ship and put to sea, but 4 of the men were so captivated with the ladies and the luxuries of the place that they remained in the island, and one of them married and settled there. Davis now sailed for Bonavista, and perceived nothing in that harbor, steered for the Isle of May. Arriving there, he found several vessels in the harbor, and plundered them of whatever he found necessary. He also received a considerable reinforcement of men, the greater part of whom entered willingly into the piratical service. He likewise made free with one of the ships, equipped her for his own purpose, and called her the King James. Davis next proceeded to St. Jago to take in water. Davis with some of the others going on shore to seek water, the governor came to inquire who they were, and expressed his suspicion of their being pirates. Upon this, Davis seemed highly affronted, and expressed his displeasure in the most polite but determined manner. He, however, hastened on board, informed his men, and suggested the possibility of surprising the fort during the night. Accordingly, all his men being well armed, they advanced to the assault, and from the carelessness of the guards, they were in the garrison before the inhabitants were alarmed. Upon the discovery of their danger, they took shelter in the governor's house, and fortified it against the pirates. But the latter, throwing in some grando shells, ruined the furniture, and killed several people. The alarm was circulated in the morning, and the country assembled to attack them. But unwilling to stand a siege, the pirates dismounted the gun, pillaged the fort, and fled to their ships. When at sea, they mustered their hands, and found that they were 70 strong. Then they consulted among themselves what course they should steer, and were divided in opinion. But by a majority it was carried to sail for Gambia, on the coast of Guinea. Of this opinion was the captain, who, having been employed in that trade, was acquainted with the coast, and informed his companions that there was always a large quantity of money deposited in that castle, and he was confident, if the matter was entrusted to him, that he should successfully storm that fort. From their experience of his former prudence and courage, they cheerfully submitted to his direction, in the full assurance of success. Arrived at Gambia, he ordered all his men below, except just so many as were necessary to work the vessel, that those from the fort, seeing so few hands, might have no suspicion that she was any other than a trading vessel. He then ran under the fort and cast anchor, and, having ordered out the boat, manned with 6 men indifferently dressed, he, with the master and doctor, dressed themselves like gentlemen, in order that the one party might look like foremastmen, and the other like merchants. In rowing ashore, he instructed his men what to say if any questions were put to them by the garrison. On reaching land, the party were conducted by a file of musketeers into the fort, and kindly received by the governor, who inquired what they were and whence they came. They replied that they were from Liverpool, and bound for the river Senegal, to trade for gum and elephant's teeth, but that they were chased on that coast by 2 French men of war, and narrowly escaped being taken. We were now disposed, continued Davis, to make the best of our voyage, and would willingly trade here for slaves. The governor then inquired what were the principal articles of their cargo. They replied that they were iron and plate, which were necessary articles in that place. The governor then said that he would give them slaves for all their cargo, and asked if they had any European liquor on board. They answered that they had a little for their own use, but he should have a hamper of it. He then treated them with the greatest civility, and desired them all to dine with him. Davis answered that as he was commander of the vessel, it would be necessary for him to go down to see if she were properly moored, and to give some other directions, but that these gentlemen might stay, and he would return before dinner, and bring the hamper with him. While in the fort, his eyes were keenly employed to discover the position of the arms, and how the fort might most successfully be surprised. He discovered that there was a sentry standing near a guardhouse, in which there were a quantity of arms heaped up in a corner, and that a considerable number of small arms were in the governor's hall. When he went on board, he ordered some hands on board a sloop lying at anchor, lest, hearing any bustle, they should come to the aid of the castle. Then, desiring his men to avoid too much liquor, and to be ready when he should hoist the flag from the walls to come to his assistance, he proceeded to the castle. Having taken these precautions, and formed these arrangements, he ordered every man who was to accompany him to arm himself with 2 pairs of pistols, which he himself also did, concealed under their clothes. He then directed them to go to the guard-room, and fall into conversation, and immediately upon his firing a pistol out of the governor's window, to shut the men up and secure the arms in the guard-room. When Davis arrived, dinner not being ready, the governor proposed that they should pass the time in making a bowl of punch. Davis's boatswain, attending him, had an opportunity of visiting all parts of the house and observing their strength. He whispered his intelligence to his master, who, being surrounded by his own friends, and seeing the governor unattended by any of his retinue, presented a pistol to the breast of the latter, informing him that he was a dead man unless he should surrender the fort and all its riches. The governor, thus taken by surprise, was compelled to submit, for Davis took down all the pistols that hung in the hall and loaded them. He then fired his pistol out of the window. His men flew like lions, presenting their pistols to the soldiers, and while some carried out the arms, the rest secured the military, and shut them all up in the guard-house, placing a guard on the door. Then one of them struck the Union flag on top of the castle, which the men from the vessel perceiving, rushed to the combat, and in an instant were in possession of the castle, without tumult or bloodshed. Davis then harangued the soldiers, many of whom enlisted with him, and those who declined he put on board the small ships, and to prevent the necessity of a guard, or the possibility of escape, carried off the sails, rigging, and cables. That day being spent in feasting and rejoicing, the castle saluting the ship, and the ship the castle, on the day following they proceeded to examine the contents of their prize. They, however, were greatly disappointed in their expectations, a large sum of money having been sent off a few days before. But they found money, to the amount of about £2,000 in gold, and many valuable articles of different kinds. They carried on board their vessel whatever they deemed useful, gave several articles to the captain and crew of the small vessel, and allowed them to depart, while they dismounted the guns and demolished the fortifications. After doing all the mischief that their vicious minds could possibly devise, they weighed anchor, but in the meantime, perceiving a small sail bearing towards them with all possible speed, they hastened to prepare for her reception, and made towards her. Upon her near approach, they discovered that she was a French pirate of 14 guns and 64 men, and one half French, the other half negroes. The Frenchmen were in high expectation of a rich prize, but when he came nearer, he suspected, from the number of her guns and men, that she was a small English man of war. He determined, notwithstanding, upon the bold attempt of boarding her, and immediately fired a gun, and hoisted his black colours. Davis immediately returned the compliment. The Frenchman was highly gratified at this discovery. Both hoisted out their boats and congratulated each other. Mutual civilities and good offices passed, and the French captain proposed to Davis to sail down the coast with him, in order to look out for a better ship, assuring him that the very first that could be captured should be his, as he was always willing to encourage an industrious brother. They first touched at Sierra Leone, where they espied a large vessel, and Davis, being the swifter sailor, came first up with him. He was not a little surprised that she did not endeavor to make off, and began to suspect her strength. When he came back alongside her, she fired a whole broadside, and hoisted black colours. Davis did the same, and fired a gun to leeward. The satisfaction of these brothers in iniquity was mutual, at having thus acquired so much additional strength and ability to undertake more formidable adventures. 2 days were devoted to mirth and song, and upon the third, Davis and Coquelin, the captain of the new Confederate, agreed to go in the French pirate ship to attack the fort. When they approached, the men in the fort, apprehensive of their character and intentions, fired all the guns upon them at once. The ship returned the fire, and afforded employment until the 2 other ships arrived, when the men in the fort, seeing such a number on board, lost courage, and abandoned the fort to the mercy of the robbers. They took possession, remained there 7 weeks, and cleaned their vessels. They then called a council of war to deliberate concerning future undertakings, when it was resolved to sail down the coast in company, and for the greater regularity and grandeur Davis was chosen commodore. That dangerous enemy, strong drink, had well nigh, however, sown the seeds of discord among these affectionate brethren. But Davis, alike prepared for council or for war, addressed them to the following purport: "Hear ye, you Coquelin and Lebois," which was the name of the French captain. "I find, by strengthening you, I have put a rod into your hands to whip myself, but I am still able to deal with you both. However, since we met in love, let us part in love, for I find that 3 of a trade can never agree long together." Upon this, the other 2 went on board of their respective ships, and steered different courses. Davis held down the coast, and reaching Cape Apollonia, he captured 3 vessels, 2 English and 1 Scottish, plundered them, and allowed them to proceed. In 5 days after, he met with a Dutchman of 30 guns and 90 men. She gave Davis a broadside, and killed 9 of his men. A desperate engagement ensued, which continued from 1 o'clock at noon until 9 next morning, when the Dutchman struck. Davis equipped her for the pirate service, and called her the Rover. With his 2 ships he sailed for the bay of Anamaboa, which he entered upon noon, and took several vessels which were waiting to take in negroes, gold, and elephants' teeth. Davis made a present of one of these vessels to the Dutch captain and his crew, and allowed them to go in quest of their fortune. When the fort had intelligence that they were pirates, they fired at them, but without any effect. Davis fired also, and hoisted the black colors, but deemed it prudent to depart. The next day, after he left Anamaboa, the man at the masthead discovered a sail. It may be proper to inform our readers that, according to the laws of pirates, the man who first discovered a vessel is entitled to the best pair of pistols in the ship, and such is the honor attached to these, that a pair of them has been known to sell for £30. Davis pursued that vessel, which, being between him and the shore, labored hard to run aground. Davis, perceiving this, got between her and the land, and fired a broadside at her, when she immediately struck. She proved to be a very rich prize, having on board the governor of Accra, with all his substance going to Holland. There was in money to the amount of £15,000, beside a large quantity of merchant goods and other valuable articles. Before they reached the Isle of Princes, the St. James sprang a leak, so that the men and the valuable articles were removed into Davis's own ship. When he came in sight of the fort, he hoisted English colors. The Portuguese, seeing a large ship sailing towards the shore, sent a sloop to discover her character and destination. Davis informed them that he was an English man of war, sent out in search of some pirates which they had heard were in this quarter. Upon this he was piloted into the port, and anchored below the guns at the fort. The governor was happy to have Englishmen in his harbor, and to do honor to Davis sent down a file of musketeers to escort him to the fort, while Davis, the more to cover his design, ordered 9 men, according to the custom of the English, to row him on shore. Davis also took the opportunity of cleaning and preparing all things for renewing his operations. He, however, could not contentedly leave the fort without receiving some of the riches of the island. He formed a scheme to accomplish his purpose, and communicated the same to his men. His design was to make the governor a present of a few negroes in return for his kindness, then to invite him, with a few of his principal men and friars belonging to the island, to dine on board his ship, and secure them all in irons until each of them would give a large ransom. They were accordingly invited, and very readily consented to go, and, deeming themselves honored by his attention, all that were invited would certainly have gone on board. Fortunately, however, for them, a negro who was privy to the horrible plan of Davis swam on shore during the night, and gave information of the danger to the governor. Retreat of the pirates, and death of Captain Davis. The governor occupied the whole night in strengthening the defences and posting the men in the most advantageous places. Soon after daybreak the pirates, with Captain Davis at their head, were discovered landing from the boats, and quickly marched across the open space towards the fort. A brisk fire was opened upon them from the fort, which they returned in a spirited manner. At length a hand grenade thrown from the wooden veranda of the fort killed 3 of the pirates, but several of the Portuguese were killed. The veranda of the fort being of wood and very dry, it was set fire to by the pirates. This was a great advantage to the attacking party, who could now distinguish those in the fort without being so clearly seen themselves. But at this moment Captain Davis fell, mortally wounded by a musket ball in his belly. The fall of their chief, and the determined resistance of those in the fort, checked the impetuosity of the assailants. They hesitated, and at last retreated, bearing away with them their wounded commander. The Portuguese cheered, and led on by the governor now became the assailants. Still the pirates' retreat was orderly. They fired and retired, rank behind rank, successively. They kept the Portuguese at bay until they had arrived at the boats, when a charge was made and a severe conflict ensued. But the pirates had lost too many men, and without their captain felt dispirited. As they lifted Davis into the boat in his dying agonies, he fired his pistol at his pursuers. They now pulled with all their might to escape from the muskets of the Portuguese, who followed them along the banks of the river, annoying them in their retreat to the vessel. And those on board, who expected to hoist in treasure, had to receive naught but their wounded comrades and dead commander. End of chapter 12.